die and your life flashes before your eyes, what will you see? What places will you have been? Who will be the people in your story? What will be your theme song? In the end, what will be the myth that you'll have lived? This sort of question lingered with me when I was fairly young, and it led me to want to teach. And in teaching, I eventually had to use metaphors to convey some tricky ideas. Of course, eventually I found mythology as a wonderful catalog, a wonderful reserve of all these metaphors. Now, if you think of it, we've only had written language for about 5,000 years. And before that, how did people pass on their ideas? How did they pass on their lessons? How did they pass on their wisdoms? Well, they used story. I love story, not necessarily just for its own sake, but for what it can do, or what you can do with it. Slideshow. There we go. Let's go back one. There we go. Story. Thanks. Now, being a mythologist, you get, of course, one of the difficulty pieces is you have to deal with the question of what myth is. To us, many times, myth is a lie, And Picasso said the same about art. He said, art is a lie that reveals the truth. Now, the same could be said about myth once you understand three things. First of all, myths are, many times, they're very memorable. So you can find them being passed throughout time. They're also universal. You can find pieces of them all around the world. And lastly, they're metaphorical. They contain secrets in them. They have wisdoms in them. Now, the key to understanding this is the motif. As a mythologist, I usually get three types of requests. First is what I call the story hunter. This is where people ask me to find a story for them. So for example, a scientist might they're on the edge of a discovery, and they're worried that people aren't going to understand what they do. So they want me to find that story. They don't want to have their gold turned to ash. Then I have what I call the story growers. These are the people who work with stories. These are the people who are growing stories. Artists, filmmakers, writers, poets. These are the people who want their stories to resonate deeply with their audience. And lastly, we have the people I call the story foragers. These are the people who have stumbled across a story they might have found that resonated with them. They want to interpret it. They want to find how this connects with their life. Or maybe they want to unlearn a story that they're telling within themselves. It's sort of like soup. For the scientist, they just need a bowl to carry the idea. For the artist, their idea, or their story is their work. And so they want to find good recipes to make sure that this works. And for the people who are working with interpretation, they want to know what they've eaten. And they want to see if they can find something maybe better or see therein. Now the key, my task is finding a story, of course. Their task is to understand what a motif is and how those resonate with them. Now, one of the most common motifs is the hero journey, or the hero. That is the hero that goes off on their own road, they overcome obstacles, and in the end, they achieve some potential. Here's a chart called the hero's journey. It has lots of different motifs. Once you have the hero motif, a lot of times these go in together. There's the call to adventure. There's a crossing into another land. There's the road of trials. Now, the important piece about this is you probably never seen this chart before, but I can guarantee you have seen this before. As Todd said, it's been built. They use this to build Star Wars. They use this to build pretty much any story in the last. Now, the piece that's important to point out is that there's a lot more motifs than just these, okay? This chart is great, and it doesn't bring in necessarily, for example, what I like to call the solar hero versus the lunar hero. Solar hero is someone who starts with their gifts. They start gifted, like Superman, for example. Or then you have what's called lunar hero, someone who has to be essentially wounded, or they have to suffer in order to develop their gifts. So for example, like Batman. And this is an idea that people really resonate in their own lives. Did you develop your gifts on your own? Did you start with it? You just knew what you wanted to do when you were young? And so this is how a story helps us do this. Now, I caution you, identifying with myth is good, but if you get caught too much in the story, for example, say you think, you're Superman, you might find one day you've got a different story going on inside. So the question, of course, is when you get asked, hey, I need a metaphor for something. I need a story for something, right? There's no method for this. I mean, storytelling has become really big recently, especially in professional areas. And so, how do you go about doing it? Now, say I give you a task. Say I ask you, all right, there's something out there you're very familiar with. You use it every day. I need a story for it. Ready? What's the story behind electricity? What's the myth behind electricity? What's a way I can understand it, right? You feel the hesitation? It's like, it's still magic for us. It's been like hundreds of years that we've been playing with this stuff, and it's still magical. And so, at this point, what if you could imagine a world where everyone, even a 5-year-old, could understand how it works very easily? Throughout time, we've always had stories that taught us about innovations, inventions. There was, archery, agriculture, fire. There was always something that helped us to convey these tools. The stories helped to spread these. There was a deity that had the archery. This is the bow. You get the wood from this tree. It's sacred to this deity, for example. That's one of the example requests. Now, of course, again, you get a question about creativity as another request. So, a lot of times people ask about creative process, and I love it because do you really believe that people haven't thought about this for thousands of years? One of the pieces to it, of course, is you don't have to be a genius to find that story, because genius is the story. To the Romans, a genius was a little spirit that sat on your shoulder and it gave you good ideas or not. Now, this word genius came from the Persian word jinn, which was genie. Now, there's a type of a jinn called aquarium, and it sat on your shoulder and it gave you good ideas or not. You can go to Oregon in the Nez Perce tribe, Native Americans. They have what's called a Wayakin. This is the little spirit that you go and find, and it teaches you what your gifts are and how to give them. Now, the Greeks have a wonderful way of going about this. They have what's called poesis. Now, poesis is another word. There's one scholar who says that poesis evolved into Pegasus. Now, the story of Pegasus is Perseus had to cut off Medusa's head. And once he cut off Medusa's head, then Pegasus, the winged horse, was born. Okay? So here's a trick for finding a metaphor within a story. Get rid of the names, okay? So what happens is you have someone who goes and they figure out what that thing is that's trying to turn them to stone. That's like writer's block, okay? You get rid of the thinking, get rid of the thoughts. And, once he does this, a bunch of blood and snakes and stuff come out. And so you have the million bad words sort of thing. And then after that, Pegasus, the winged horse, is born. Now, it's also important to point out that Perseus does not ride Pegasus. In the original story, he gives Pegasus to Athena. And that is to point out that the art carries the wisdom. The myths carry wisdom. It's all encoded in that. Now, another, of course, request, as I said, is the interpretation. So I get to work with youth a lot, which is really fun. And many times I'll have a kid walk in and they'll be having a hard time maybe with their parent, and they might say, my parents sometimes, it doesn't feel like they say something that reminds me of this kind of idea of, rather than parents feeding the kid, of eating the kid. And so the question at that point is, do you want to tell the story of Jack and the Beanstalk? Do you want to tell Hansel and Gretel? Or Saturn and Kronos? Or eating his own kids? I might have someone who tells me about working a job every day that doesn't really work for them and having to go off. And it reminds me of the Odyssey. It reminds me of Odysseus going on this journey every day that he's not interested in. James Joyce wrote Ulysses, updating that story into the day and day. Of course, you also have the idea of intuition. Say you needed to learn to listen to yourself more. Well, what is intuition? Well, my recommendation is Wizard of Oz. Look at Toto. Look at their interaction with Dorothy and Toto, but also look at the interaction between Toto and the witch. And that, from the very beginning, tells you a lot about how intuition works. So one of the things that's tricky, of course, is for yourselves. How do you guys go about finding metaphors? How do you find stories that really work? I mean, you don't have to be like me. I sit there and I read a new story every day, and I catalog it, and I'm kind of weird. But, I do this because I love it, sort of thing. Well, so what I've done is, with the help of the Center for Symbolic Studies, and to honor the folklorist Stith Thompson, I built a search engine of Stith Thompson's work. And it allows you to search through 50,000 different patterns in stories. So you can find a story that resonates with you. And what's happened is, playing with these stories, with these motifs, we found some really interesting things happen. For example, I had an intern who came in, and she told me that, her personal myth that she was saying was, I'm not creative in the least. I don't have a creative bone in my body. And so I said, all right. So what I did was I had her get a piece of paper, and I wrote 1, 2, 3 on it. I had her search for a motif that resonated with her. That was important. And at that point, I had her put the motif at point 3, and I said, please, can you try writing a story to get to point 3? I was curious to see what happened. Now, within 15 minutes, not only had this person, who, not creative, keep in mind, had written an entire story. The entire thing rhymed. Now, this was her experiencing a part of herself she'd never known. Now, a lot of people have asked me about doing this sort of method. So what we've done is we've given the search engine a Twitter account that gives motifs every 15 minutes. So if you want to play with this sort of thing and see some different motifs, you can. Now, another example of using story might be, I was working with a 5-year-old. A mother brought her son to me, and she said, my son's father has a terminal illness, and he's going to die. And can you prepare my son for the dying process? Can you do this without him knowing? I want it to be natural. And I said, yeah, sure, that's easy. Come on. How many stories do you know with an orphan in it? How many stories do you know where a parent gets lost or 2 parents get lost? So what happened was, we began to read stories about death. And we began to read the different stories to him and find ones that, for the most part that really resonated with him. And as it were, father passed away, and then through the course of it, he started to have a difficulty because he started to have nightmares. And so his mother asked me, can you help deal with this? Well, now I had a problem because I know that he has a nightmare. He has a monster in his dreams, but you can't kill the monster, right? Because the monster's death. There's nothing I can do that can bring his father back. So how can I read a story where a hero kills a monster? That doesn't make any sense at all. So what I had to do was I had to find stories where the monster, rather than being killed, gets transformed. Well, at the same time, I was taking that search engine I just showed, and I was running it through a program called Gorse. And Gorse allows you to map the motifs in different ways. So here's a map that it'll actually go through. It says transformation. Now this is all the monster motifs that I have, and the green branch is the ones that transform. And what happens is, at this point, I can start reading him stories. And every time I would read him a story, I would say, is the monster going to be killed, or will it be changed? And he said, I want it to be killed. But, of course, I'm picking the stories. So it's not going to get, And what happened was, a week later, he came in. He was very, very excited. You see, he had a dream where there was a dragon chasing him. And through the course of it, rather than turning and running, he turned and he faced the dragon, and he said, I don't want you to breathe fire anymore. I want you to breathe water. And then it did, and it couldn't hurt him. If you want to change the stories inside, find variations, because it's very important to understand that you can live through the stories rather than the stories living through you. So to wrap this up, if you want to play with this stuff, pay attention to the stories that resonate with you. Pay attention to what you've loved. See if you can spot motifs within it. See if you can spot the patterns between stories, between your stories and your life. And in the end, take away the names and see if you can find some metaphors or some ways you can apply this. Oh, and really quickly, I did ask the question, what's the myth of electricity? So here we have Ohm's law. Voltage equals current times resistance. And voltage is another name for potential energy, okay? So the idea of potential, as I said, is the goal of the hero. So in the end, the hero achieves their potential by going on their own road and overcoming obstacles. That is to say, the current is the journey, the resistance is like the obstacles. And so right there, that's what we call the power of myth. Thank you.